from the American Society for Microbiology. This is TWiM, This Week in Microbiology. This is episode 145, recorded on February 7th, 2017. This episode is brought to you by Blue Apron. Blue Apron is the #1 fresh ingredient and recipe delivery service in the country. See what's on the menu this week and get your first 3 meals free with free shipping by going to blueapron.com/TWiM. Hi, everybody. I'm Vincent Racaniello, and you're listening to the podcast that explores unseen life on Earth. Coming to you today from Washington, D.C., we are at the ASM Biothreats meeting. And this is a meeting that covers a wide range of biological threats and emerging infectious diseases. This episode of TWiM is all about careers, specifically anything but academic. My guests today are 3 scientifically trained individuals who have selected careers away from the ivory tower. So we're going to hear about how they got there, what they do there, and whether there are any opportunities for up-and-coming scientists to do similar things. My guests are all friends of mine. To my right, she is from the Rocky Mountain Laboratories in beautiful Hamilton, Montana. M.Bosio, thank you for being with us. This is not your first visit to TWiM. You've been on TWiM before, and I've been twice out to that wonderful laboratory in the mountains there. To her right, from the American Society for Microbiology, Shilpa Gadwal, welcome.
Hello, everyone.
Thanks for coming. And finally, all the way at the end, he is from the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, fondly known as BARDA, Michael Merchlinsky.
Hi.
Welcome, Michael.
Thanks.
And these 3 individuals, as you can tell from where they are not in academia, which is, of course, where I am. Now, when I was training, which was eons ago, I learned from my PI to be an academic scientist because that's all he knew. But nowadays, it's different, and we'd like to explore today how these individuals got to where they were. And the first thing I'd love to hear about all of you is your path to where you are today. Where you're from and where you were educated and trained. Let's start with you, Katie.
We only have an hour.
Yeah, I know have an hour, yes. It's a long path.
Well, it was a little bit of a journey, I'd say, but I'll keep it brief. So I got my PhD at Colorado State University, studying tuberculosis, and then part of the complicating factor here is I married a scientist, and so we were both looking for postdocs at that time, and we both wanted to be in the lab. So I did my first postdoc at FDA CBER, and then I did a second postdoc at USAMRIID, and so I switched fields from working on bacteria to viruses, Ebola and Marburg. Had a few other career events in there, and then wound up as a non-tenured track at Colorado State University, where both my husband were on faculty, and then I had an opportunity to compete for a tenured track position at the NIH labs and Rocky Mountain labs. And what was really beneficial to me is that because I had spent time with FDA CBER, which was at that time located on the Bethesda campus, I was quite familiar with the NIH system and what being a tenure track within that system meant. And I was really surprised, as there are a lot of people, when they heard I was going there, they're like, well, what does that mean? Do you have to teach? Do you have to write grants? What committees do you serve on? And maybe you'll ask me about that later, but we're not required to do any of those things. And so that's how I
use a lot of the same words that we use in academics for the things that you do.
Very much.
Did you always want to be in science as far back as you can remember?
Yeah, I was really, really fortunate. I had some wonderful science teachers. Sandra Dexter was my 7th and 8th grade science teacher and really let us explore our capabilities and got us involved in science fairs. And then I had great high school teachers, and the reason why I wound up at graduate school at Colorado State is I had a great mentor at Washington State University, Skip Pasnokis, who actually called Carol Blair and said, I have this great student, are there any opportunities for internships? Right. And so I've been really fortunate to have great mentors all along the way, even through postdocs at CSU, et cetera, et cetera. So.
Well, they're key, right? Mentors are the key to the whole thing.
They are. They can take a student who has maybe a spark of an interest and either squelch that or kind of let it grow and build into a fire. So.
And something else you mentioned, 7th and 8th grade teachers. The early science teachers are so important. We did a TWiM out in Hamilton last year in November, where we had a couple of local science high school teachers with their former students who now, some of them work in your lab, and you have one in your lab.
That's right, I do have one in my lab.
And this is a great story, and we called the episode Small Town, Big Science,
right.
because it can happen anywhere. And of course, you have an NIH lab in the middle of nowhere. You can really inspire some people.
Yeah.
Shilpa, how did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, so I'm actually as local as they come. I grew up here in Maryland, and I went to University of Maryland, Baltimore County for undergrad, where I majored in biology. And a lot of my research focused around microbiology, and that's how I became very interested in micro, and decided to pursue that as a PhD at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And so I got my PhD in microbiology and immunology, and while I was in graduate school, I realized like I didn't want to go the research route, but I was trying to figure out, well, what do I want to do with my PhD? And so I spent a lot of time exploring different careers. And ultimately, what I do now is I do career development and professional development, focusing on graduate students and postdocs. And what that means essentially is it's basically exposing students and postdocs to the types of careers that are out there for them, and then how to get that experience that's needed to get into whatever specific field. And while I was in grad school, this became sort of a very big field and expanded quite a bit, because the same time I was in grad school, I graduated in grad school in 2014, but 2 years before that, in 2012, NIH reported on what students do after they get their PhDs, and what they found was most of them don't go the academia route. And they were starting to see that the way we train students is for academia, but most of them don't go. And so there was sort of this explosion of the field in the sense that, well, we need to change the curriculum then to prepare students correctly for whatever field they're interested in. And so from that time, like when I was in grad school, even Michigan, like they hired someone in the graduate school to take on this task. And so I paired up with that person right away, and that's when I realized like this is something I really like doing, because, you know, as we all know, PhD scientists, very talented, they can go on to do great things, and it's just a matter of helping them figure out exactly what they want to do and what they're passionate about. And so that's how I got into this.
So were you also interested in science long before you went to college?
Yeah, so I actually had, I got introduced to microbiology when I was in high school, and I had a high school teacher. I was in 10th grade, and one of the most fascinating things about microbiology is just, and I worked more with bacteriology when I was in grad school, but to me, like the most fascinating thing was the interplay between bacteria and the human host, and just how, you know, something so small can come in and really change a system. And so that's really what made me passionate about microbiology, and that's how I decided to go that route. And when I was in undergrad, I did research opportunities, you know, just at different universities across the US, and that sort of solidified my passion for microbiology, because most of them were focused in microbiology-related topics then.
So at ASM, you're a career advancement fellow.
Yeah, and so at ASM right now, I'm actually a postdoc. So ASM has these headquarter fellowships, which it's basically they bring you in to do a project. And so as a career advancement fellow, I work on putting together a career website and understanding the needs of microbiologists, the career needs of microbiologists. And so I really leveraged, you know, just the information I gained from doing a survey on the career needs of young microbiologists to create a website. And then now I focus on the career blogs for the society as well, so.
Okay, we'll hear more from you, but I want to hear Michael's story. Where are you from originally?
My story, I think, is much more accidental than the two that seem to be better planned out. I actually went to college to major in physics or math, and at that time I took a course on zoology as an elective to fill out my general education requirements, and was fascinated by it, and immediately took genetics, and then was fascinated by that, and never actually went back. And I'm old enough that at the time when I was going to school was with the, you know, they hadn't discovered splicing yet. They were, every month seemed like a new discovery of molecular biology, and it was really the field to go in. And so I got into graduate school. I went to Dr. Dave Ward's lab at Yale, who was working on parvoviruses. And I did my PhD there, then moved to NIH to work in Dr. Bernard Moss in the largest, so I went from the smallest to the largest virus, which was pox viruses, and worked there for a number of years. But then it became clear when I was going to move on, I went to the FDA, and I had a lab at CBER. And while at CBER, I ended up having doing a lot of regulatory responsibilities. I was an inspector going out to see test manufacturing and involved in policy, and then involved with any poxvirus vaccines. And then after 9/11, the regulatory burden became such that it became harder and harder to actually maintain a lab. And then I had this opportunity at BARDA. And BARDA is an organization which was set up by Congress in order to help products pass from the proof of concepts to the regulatory approval. And it turns out that that's the hardest part of a product, getting it from a status where you can work it in mice or do it in tissue culture and get it to a licensed product. And it turns out that expertise wasn't at NIH. That expertise was in companies for the most part. And so BARDA was sort of smashed together with people who had company experience, people who had FDA experience, and then young scientists to help manage the contracts. And our job, again, is to take things to licensure, which is where I am today.
How long have you been at BARDA now?
I've been at BARDA 8 years.
8 years, okay. We're going to hear more about what you do there. It'd be interesting to know your thoughts later about the direction of the FDA, because as you know, looks like things are in flux with respect to drug approvals, but we'll get back to that. So Katie, tell us what you do. You have a laboratory in the beautiful valley there, and you do science, right?
I do science every day. Some more than others.
Do you do experiments?
I do, I think, and for me, that's really probably one of the greatest benefits of being with the NIH and working in NIAID is, and in fact, it was just last weekend, I ran into a postdoc, and he had a friend up from the university who's finishing his PhD. And we were talking, he's like, oh, I was just telling him that, you still go into the lab. And I'm like, and you're not afraid of me, right? He's like, no. And he commented, and this is the first time I've heard a student say that, is that he really appreciated that because he felt like then the PI was more connected to their students and their fellows and really had a better understanding of sort of what was going on in the lab and even small things. It's not just like, oh, what blot are you developing there? But, this isn't working, or, look at this is a really cool result. So it's been very beneficial to me. And then on top of that, I work on Francisella tularensis, or tularemia. So we have an ABSL3 and BSL3 lab that has to follow all the federal select agent regulations. So being able to be in those environments too, where there's just a lot of added responsibility and just really attention to detail is important to me too. So I can kind of understand what people are doing and where they're going.
So you have a typical lab structure. It's you, and then tell us about that a little bit.
So I could have a graduate student. We have the capability to do that. But my lab...
They would be with a local college?
They would. They're usually funneled through the University of Montana. Okay. That's right. And NIH, I believe NIH and Bethesda has similar programs. But most of the NIH labs either have postdoctoral fellows or what are called post-baccalaureate fellows. I have a mixture of those two. I've vacillated back and forth between just having postdocs or having a couple of postbacs. The postbac system is fantastic because we get what are essentially brand new graduate students. So they finish their bachelor's degree and they're thinking about going to professional school or graduate school, but they really want to have an intensive research experience. And so we have this program in place that gives them that experience. They work in the lab just like any graduate student would. They get projects. The whole end goal is to get them on publications and get them that experience. So I have students, and then I have technical assistants as well that are part of the government.
So these people come from not just locally; they're from all over the world.
All over the world. I mean, at RML, just like really any university or the NIH campus here, we have fellows from Africa and France and South America. I mean, everywhere. So yeah.
And of course, this is just your lab. There are many labs at Rocky Mountain.
That's right, that's right. So we have the laboratory of virology, laboratory of bacteriology, laboratory of persistent viral diseases, and laboratory of zoonotic pathogens.
Okay.
So I'm trying to add up the PIs, but we have about, I think, 400 people in total at the facility, so it's not huge, but yeah.
Now, this is unusual for an NIH lab to be other than in Bethesda, right?
Yeah,
Are there others besides Hamilton?
There are. There's one in North Carolina as well, and I think well, obviously NCI and Frederick. They're quite close, but yeah.
So this is a limited, it's not like the university system that has lots and lots of labs.
No,
it's limited,
no. I mean, in terms of, permanent institutes, yeah, that's.
Now, when it comes to what you work on, did you decide when you came, or is it a mixture of that and then someone telling you what you should do?
Well, they were interested in hiring someone to do Rickettsia work, actually.
Okay.
But I had a program that was ongoing in tularemia and plague at Colorado State, and I was very enthusiastic about that program. We're trying to understand pulmonary immunity, and so as part of the hiring process, I said, I'd be happy to help someone set up an animal model for Rickettsia, but I really didn't have any experience in that. And at the end of the day, they really wanted an in vivo immunologist, which is exactly what I was, to work on these high consequence pathogens. So I was able to bring what I was doing there. I dropped the plague work because just advice for all of you out there that are thinking about doing this, focus, focus, focus. So that's why I stuck with tularemia.
You dropped it like the plague, right?
Just like that.
So over the years, have you taken on new projects, or are you pretty much focused on what you started out with?
I was awarded tenure 2 years ago. And so up to that point, I really focused just on tularemia. But as a spin out of that, because one thing that we're interested in is, so Francisella is a very immunomodulatory pathogen. It likes to dampen the inflammatory response. It's quite good at that. And so we had a directive to identify the molecules of the bacterium that allowed it to do that in the mechanism. And the fallout from that was now we have these products that could be potentially used as novel anti-inflammatories. Okay? And so we were now starting to work with West Nile virus, initially in collaboration with some of the folks at RML, because we have a great virology lab that's just upstairs. And so we're interested in bringing in some of those other pathogens. So in a way, we're sort of branching out, but still within the confines, I think, of what we're working on.
So you mentioned this word tenure.
Yes.
Which is an ivory tower word, right?
It is, yes.
So there is tenure at, what does that mean at NIH?
So at NIH, what that means is that for all intensive purposes, you're a permanent government employee. In fact, I had one person describe it to me as you have a grant for life, which is great. But I should add that the NIH positions, we still have to justify what we do. It's not like we're just given money all the time to do whatever we want. I mean, we have to have very well-defined programs. We get reviewed by an extramural committee every 3 to 4 years. We get reviewed internally. And so it's not, I think some people have this idea that we're just flush with dollars. And while we are given a budget, we do have to justify that. But yeah, having tenure is a good thing at NIH.
So do you think there are clearly similarities with academic positions, right? You don't call yourselves professors, right?
No.
Scientists, I think,
Yeah.
is the name,
Yeah.
right? How are they similar and how are they different, NIH versus academics?
So being a principal investigator, senior investigator with NIH, I don't have a lot of the additional administrative duties that you would have at a university. I have some. I serve on committees. I still do all the extramural things. I review papers. I serve on program committees for meetings. But I don't have to, for example, I don't have graduate students per se necessarily. I don't serve on graduate committees. I don't have to write a grant because I get a budget. Now, if we want to supplement that, we're restricted from writing grants to NIH, obviously, because that would be double dipping.
Right.
But we can write for grants like to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, things like that. So I'd really say probably the biggest difference is a lot of the administrative responsibilities were relieved of those, which is why I can still be in the lab if I choose to be.
Do you ever sense any jealousy on the part of your academic colleagues?
I don't know if I'd call it jealousy. I think
Maybe respect.
Well,
because you have a good job.
well, I think what benefits me is I was in that arena.
Yeah,
so
sure.
I completely understand, what it's like to be there and the struggle, and certainly nowadays with the funding level so low. I think my experience in that way, because I'm able to talk to these individuals and I'm like, oh, I know what you're feeling. I know what it is to have 3 graduate students and you have 2 grants that you have to submit, on and on and on. So that's my experience is a little bit different there because I'm able to talk with them.
Got it. Yeah, you've been in both sides.
Yeah.
Okay. Shilpa, I'm curious. You mentioned when you were at Michigan, you decided that bench science wasn't for you. Can I ask you what prompted that? Was there any particular, or just the whole picture, or was it?
Well, so for me personally, doing research it's exciting in some ways, in the sense that you're studying something that no one else has ever looked at, right? Mm-hmm. So that just having that notion of this is the first time I'm looking at this under the microscope, or I'm the first one who knows this privileged knowledge that no one else knows. That was very exciting, but when it really came down to it, the one thing I realized with research is that it's a very ongoing process, and for me, the notion of doing research and becoming a PI, I was more interested in sort of the student development aspect, and so that's why. As a PI, sometimes you do spend some of your, depending on what university you're at, you could spend most of your time, writing grants. Sometimes you can be involved, with the mentoring process of the student. So, when it came down to it, I was definitely looking for a job that had a mentoring component to it. There are options in academia, but ultimately, what led me away from research was. The fact that I just wanted to really focus on the mentoring aspect without worrying about the other things that come with a tenure track position, which is, applying for grants. And that was really the main thing.
Okay. So you're at ASM in a postdoctoral capacity to learn mentoring skills in terms of career advice. Tell us a little bit more detail what you do there.
Yeah, so when I saw the position at ASM, the job description for it, they were definitely looking for someone with a PhD in microbiology because they wanted that person to be able to understand the path of a PhD and the fact that, there's a process of going from a bachelor's, maybe even to a master's to a PhD, and then, pursuing a postdoc. And so they wanted someone to have that knowledge of what it's like to essentially go through a PhD. And then the 3 things they essentially wanted me to look at as a fellow was understand what the career needs are of microbiologists. These are training microbiologists. And then they wanted me to create a career website that essentially fits that need of what the microbiologists want. And then the 3rd thing was to just take an overall, just look at the overall organization as a whole to see what career activities are we doing and are we meeting those needs. And so when I started off at ASM, the first thing I did was I did focus groups with both graduate students, postdocs, students that attend school here in the U.S., in other countries that are non-U.S., because as you guys know, ASM is a global organization. And based off, and in these focus groups, I was asking them about, what their worries were, entering the market. What things do you guys worry about? What resources do you want to see from ASM? What are some of the biggest challenges you have right now as you think about your career? And then based off of this open-ended discussion, I created a survey, which then I sent out to all of the members to complete, just to get an idea of, what do they need? And so a lot of that was asking, what kind of professions do you want to go into? What kind of sectors? And so what's interesting was that almost over half of them were not interested in an academic job. I even ask about like, what kind of skills do you feel like you're lacking or that you want to develop? And so, you know, I cover things from communication to managerial to interpersonal skills. And then based on these results and the feedback I got from these surveys, I used this to design the career website then that I worked on at ASM. And that kind of gave me also sort of a level of like, okay, this is what the students need of ASM. What is ASM doing? And so that's how I also gauge that as well. And so since I've come on, it's interesting to see how much ASM has been changing in the sense that they really are focused on industry and government positions, which is what students are interested in moving into. So, you know, it's nice to see that this is actually, you know, making an impact, the work that I've done.
So where can listeners find this website?
Yeah, so if you go to asm.org and you click on the careers tab, that's the website right there. And as I was doing the survey, two of the biggest things that came up was most students were wondering what can they do with a microbiology degree. And so there's a portion in that site that focuses on microbiology careers and has things like, you know, like different career panels like this one that we're doing to just like different like Q&A type things with people that are currently in the workforce. And then another thing that came up too was how do I make myself competitive? You know, how do I, like simple things like how do I put a resume together, which a lot of students don't know because they're used to being in academia and doing a CV. Those are the types of questions that we cover as well in the career website. So
you mentioned some alternatives like industry, government, but there's certainly more, right?
There's definitely more, yeah. You know, there's things like patent law, for example, if you're interested in just like knowing like what kind of technologies are out there, and like if you're really interested in technology and knowing what the latest things are, that's definitely like you get hot off the press information of what's out there. So that's something to consider, as well as like, you know, there's science outreach, which is very popular, science communication. There's several careers, like the stuff I do, career development as well, is very big for scientists. So, yeah.
Okay. Yes. Yeah, so you want her to use this? Okay, they want you to use this because your mic is making noise with the zipper thing. Okay, so when you, in the future, well, you're done for now. I want to talk to Michael for a little bit. Michael, BARDA. We actually had a friend of yours, Ed Niles.
Yeah, Ed and I go back a long way.
You guys know each other. What do you actually do at BARDA? Tell us.
Let me go a little off script.
Sure.
And first say that similar to what was talked about with the NIH and NIAID, the FDA also has a research component,
right,
and has labs both in CBER and CDER, both in biologics and drugs. And I actually ran a lab there for 12 years. And same process of tenure. It's very similar to what occurs in academia, where the problem is your hard money is sort of fixed because of you can't apply for NIH grants, but you can apply for grants in our milieu is places like National Vaccine Council and so forth. And what you find is that the work ends up being less academic and more focused or more applied, because that's there's the use of science in the FDA in terms of measuring potency, in terms of evaluating products, is very important, and there needs to be a lot of research done in that area. Now, to move to BARDA, BARDA is composed really of two groups of scientists. We have a whole bunch of 30-somethings, I call them. They're relatively young, and most of them have PhDs, and most of them got to the end of their PhD and realized that the lab wasn't the best place for them. And there's a number of reasons for that. I think you mentioned many of them. Some of them just don't like the failure. I mean, anyone here who has worked in lab knows it's 99% perspiration and about 1% inspiration and about 80% failure. And there were a lot of people who just can't handle that. And some of the best people who've worked for me left because they couldn't handle that. Not because they weren't any good, but because they just, academic research takes a certain type of crippled mind, I think, at times. And so these are people who were looking for alternative careers. And what they found is that they do what we call contract management. And by that, I mean, if we have a contract at BARDA that we're going to work on the next Ebola vaccine, the company sends us a proposal, and we're going to support this vaccine, and we're going to spend tens of millions of dollars or whatever it is to push this vaccine through the process of regulatory approval. The person who is in charge of the contract by law is called a contract officer. A contract officer has very little scientific background, but they have what's called a warrant. A warrant gives them legal authority to obligate money for the United States government. And so they have to take courses to get that, but it's not scientific. But the Corps, which is the contract officer's representative, who runs the team that evaluates and has oversight over the contract, is one of the 30-somethings who has a PhD, who has the scientific knowledge, but is not going to go forward with a lab career. So as a core, you need to have both the scientific knowledge to understand what's going on, and you get the training in terms of contract management and the other things that are required in order to maintain oversight and make sure that the money is spent correctly. Then there's a sprinkling of us graybeards, which is what I am. And I was hired in because of my experience at the FDA and because I've had a long career of 20-some years running the lab. And I am part of the team which the Corps assembles. Now, the Corps will have a specialist in maybe toxicology, because that'll come up. It may have a specialist in other things. I am what's called a subject matter expert, which means that they plug me in for scientific oversight and everything from the design of what experiments they're going to put together to impress the FDA, to what assays they're going to use, to what approach they're going to use to try to demonstrate that their product works. And so that combination of us graybeards and the cores makes up the bulk of the team, which helps oversight and make sure that the money is well spent on these contracts.
So one of the things BARDA does is to develop and purchase vaccines, drugs, therapies, as you have said. You spent a lot of time on smallpox, right? And we talked with Ed about that.
Right. I originally went in with smallpox because my background was in pox viruses, and
Right.
I was actually the chair to license ACAM 2000 at the FDA, so I was heavily involved with smallpox vaccines. But when I was at BARDA, a lot of the scientific concepts in both regulatory and in running an experiment to have the proper controls, they're maintained over whatever countermeasure you're looking at. Yeah. So I've been working on Ebola, smallpox, anthrax, botulinum intoxication, depending on designing animal models, helping people set up the right sort of experiments to do anything that you would do as part of your career. What is the best way to approach this problem? Mm-hmm. And it turns out that what most people, I think, sometimes fail to understand is the education that you receive as a graduate student or running your own lab is actually more important than people realize, because just because I can design an experiment for pox viruses doesn't mean I understand what's important to look at anthrax. And I think that the people that we have at BARDA, what I call the 30-somethings, have that knowledge which make them invaluable. And I think that it's very important, and I'm gratified to see that they understand that they're not a failure because they're not in academia. And when I started, and I think it's been mentioned before, if you weren't at the bench, you really weren't using the knowledge that you had received. But now, and I see this both in contract management, but there's policy, there's a number of things that HHS does now, that the better the scientific personnel that end up there, the better job that's going to be done.
Science has to go way beyond the lab because
Exactly.
It affects all of society, and just hiding in a lab and publishing papers is not going to achieve the end goal.
And I think that's really an important thing to remember, because I was partly involved in trying to establish a response strategy for smallpox vaccination if there was an emergency. If you put that in the hands of an economist, you could get a completely different answer maybe than if you're in the hands of a scientist. It's really important to have a high level of scientific expertise in everything from policy to contract oversight. Right. And I think that I'm happy to see that there has been, and I hadn't seen this before because before I was in BARDA, I was more in an academic or regulatory setting, but to see that the number of people that you must meet as well that are now understanding that I have this education, but it doesn't mean I have to do experiments. It means that I can apply this level of understanding to other things, I think is really important.
I'm curious, how does BARDA decide what's important, what to work on?
The first decision is made by the Department of Homeland Security.
Okay.
They tell us, and they and the CDC to a small amount, put together lists of, the A list of things that are the mainly high consequence events, and you can imagine what's there, smallpox, the anthrax, and so forth. And then there's a group of HHS and DOD that get together and say, well, if this is the threat, what are the countermeasures we need to address that threat? And so for some threats, for example, anthrax, you're going to need more antibiotics and more treatment because it doesn't spread from person to person. Whereas for a smallpox threat, you're going to want more vaccines because you're going to want to be able to block transmission in order to mitigate the event and keep it as small as possible.
Right.
So that mix will depend on the threat agent, and then we're told to go out and hopefully find those. Now, ideally, NIH has done research in those areas, and there'll be candidates that'll be at different stages of development. And then we'll either put out a request or they'll sort of submit a white paper to us as a process that they can go through, and you can find this on websites, to propose that their product be used. And then we have an evaluation process where we get experts together, usually either from BARDA, DOD, and NIH, and so forth, and sit down and evaluate the proposals and pick a winner.
Do you love your job?
I like my job.
Or is there something else you'd rather be doing?
I'd always rather be at the bench.
So you'd rather be doing experiments?
Yes,
Do you miss it?
sometimes.
You have a 99% failure, remember? But you can handle it, I guess, right?
When you don't remember the failures as you get older.
Now, let's talk a little bit about BARDA as a career. Is that for people out there who are thinking of alternative things to do, should
Okay.
use the alternative word.
Well, the first thing
Other things than academics. Is
Right,
this the reason?
okay.
Yes.
All right, I'll take it. And this is the first thing I think I need to point out is I'm the wrong generation because I've noticed that there's a generational shift. My father had one job his whole life, and I've had 3 jobs, each of about 10 years, 12 years. But the young ones who come into BARDA, the people who are coming out of college now, I think in 5-year increments.
Yeah.
That's about their thought process. So when you come to BARDA and you run a contract, you pick up contract management, you pick up a number of industry interactions, and then you either can go a number of ways. There's an administrative path. You can go in HHS. There's a path to companies and being an advisor or a contractor with them. And then there's policy where you can go out, and there's places where you can start working on a policy for how we can respond to these things. And so I see that most of the people that I work with think in terms of accumulating skills, so they'll take courses in management skills, and there's different levels of PMP and core abilities, and then to use that to then leverage for their next job, which I think is a way, if you think of this as an entry-level job, an entry-level science job, it may be even more comparable to a postdoc than it is to a career job, in the sense that they're going to take this job and then move on to a better one.
I think the point you made is really important, that this generation thinks of much shorter times for jobs. I mean, I've had one job my whole life for 35 years, and I'm probably going to just finish in that position.
I know. I feel like I was frisky because I had 3 jobs. and yet, everyone, most of the people I work with, they start thinking, well, I've been here for 3 years. What am I going to do? And I think it's a different way to look at things.
Yeah,
I think it has to do with, with the way the economy is. And I think it also has to do with, if you look at what you can take with the knowledge you have, if you go and you learn to manage contracts, if in this area of the country in particular, there's an enormous number of government contracts.
Sure.
And then you go from maybe a core to a higher level, or then you manage a bundle of contracts and so forth. So there's a lot of things you can do with that knowledge if you enjoy that type of work. There's also a different balance. I know that as someone in the lab, I know how much time that takes. And in this case, this generation is much more interested in figuring out how to telework and how to establish a balance so that they can use that knowledge, but at the same time, not give up their life. So one of the advantages to being a core or working in this sort of situation is that there's a lot of flexible scheduling. You can telework 1 or 2 days possibly, which means that everything's done at home on the phone, or you can have alternate work schedules. There's a number of things that the government has built in to try to make it more attractive to work for them.
Yeah, my son is about to graduate college. He's got a job, and he says, he's in computer science. He says to me, I'll probably work about 2 years and then move on. I'm freaking out because, right? That's not how I...
That's exactly what I see every day,
but
yes.
This is normal that he wants to do. Okay. So Katie, what about NIH as a career? You've seen both. And what about people who are thinking of is this reasonable or is it too rarefied? What are your thoughts?
You know, it goes up and down. I mean, so much of the opportunities in NIH are dependent on our government budget, right? And so, as Dr. Fauci was talking about today, in the late 80s and early the 90s, there was a doubling of the budget. We saw a huge influx of postdocs and PIs and, all of those things. So, it's hard for us if we don't have an increase or, changes in our budget, it's hard for us to add those players. Now, that being said, just like at a university setting, where you have people that are getting ready to retire at that phase of their life, and we can't have the institute not fill those positions because we need to keep things energized and continuing to move forward. And so I don't want to say that it's rarefied. I'd say it's very dependent on the where you are. But our mission, as when we have trainees come into the lab, is to train good scientists. That doesn't always mean that they wind up at the bench. And so, through my tenure process, I've sort of gained that understanding. And what I tell people now when they come to interview with me, it's like, if you wind up not working at the bench and having your own lab, that's fine. My job is to train you to be a good scientist. And that will help you, as sort of Michael was pointing out, in all these careers that you might choose. If you have that ability to really go through the thought process, of how to, think about something clearly, how do you set your hypothesis, how do you prove or disprove that hypothesis, so applicable to so many positions. And so that's really what my job is. Although I would like to add, there are no failures, there are just unexpected results, Michael. So.
I came from a harsher time.
Yeah, so it's what you do with those results that makes the difference, right?
I was trying to, it's a quick story. I had one of my favorite technicians. She was wonderful. She came to me with this experiment that failed, and she was distraught. And I said, look, here are the two controls. They're perfect.
They worked, right?
This is why they call it an experiment. You did it exactly right. There's nothing for you to worry about. But 2 years later, she had another job because she just couldn't process that. And I understand it, only I think in hindsight. I think I understand it better now where I am because I've met so many people who sort of are very successful people and very good people and smart people, bright people who said, no, I'm not going to do that. And I find them very interesting to talk to because they're all very bright. I'm sure it's the same way when you have new people come into the lab.
Sure.
That it's interesting to see how people process the same thing.
Yeah, and I think it's a time thing. That's when you touched on is that really to be successful, I think, at the bench, it's a time commitment. And we have a lot of students. I don't know if it's because they just weren't really well informed of that when they were in graduate school. I mean, I don't expect someone with a bachelor's degree to understand. That's why the post-bac program's so great, because they're like, holy cow, I have to spend a lot of time here. It's like, yeah. I think that's a key issue there, is that it is an enormous amount of time. It's a huge commitment, and if you don't adapt to that,
right.
And then you also don't have that passion to like, no, this is definitely what I want to do.
I think that passion and that love is really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure.
I think that, and also I think that to a certain amount it has to do with timing, and by that I mean that when I came in, it was early enough that things were so in flux that it was just it was the place to be, was molecular biology. It was the most exciting, it was the newest thing that was going on. Every month cell had something new that you never thought of. And I think it was easier to fall in love with it then than it is to fall in love with it now. You know, us old folks, we grumble about kits, you have to make up your own. You know, they don't understand back in the days when it was important which company you ordered your restriction enzyme from. And then the things like that I think now the world of molecular biology and microbiology has moved into a more applied realm than it was when I started. And I think that more people have a different way of looking at it than we did when we came up. And I think that it'll change. In 20 years, something may happen again. But I do feel like the population is different now, and that it's not necessarily wrong. It's just that things change. The place to be now probably is computer games, and that's probably where the people are that are the youngest and the most committed.
It's hard. My son looked into that. You have to be a designer, basically.
Yeah.
The coding. What's really hot is cybersecurity.
Well, my son was going to make his living off World of Warcraft for a while.
But I think some of that too is just having we're always thinking about, you have to make sure that you're looking forward. What's going to be sort of the next, hot thing. And when you can do that and have it apply to your program, you just see this energy come out. And, you have these students that are excited to be there. And, and that I can say that I think that is certainly an element that we're able to fulfill within NIH, is that we have access to resources that might be more difficult at certainly sort of a mid-level university. Right. So the students can get their fingers in that, and they have the ability to interact with those labs, or get in touch with that equipment that they need, et cetera. So I think the floodgates are a little bit more open with them, and that's probably one of the differences, is that we want them to have projects that we know they're going to publish on, that will give them a solid foundation for wherever they go. But we also very much encourage them to be like, let's think outside the box a little bit. How might we address this problem? Or do you need this piece of equipment? I'm sure I can find a lab that has it, and we'd either collaborate them, or you'd be able to go use it. I think that's what you have to do in order to keep it exciting.
Question for maybe for Vince is best, is that one of the things that I noticed as a postdoc, and the people were coming through the labs and they were deciding on their career choices, is what is the balance between teaching and research now? The problem I had, when I was at FDA, and probably you have, we don't have teaching responsibilities, but teaching is a very important part of the next generation. And I've talked to people since then, and that seems to be a point of trying to find that balance, because so much of research money is used for overhead, that institutions want you to make sure that you get grants, but how much are they accepting this teaching research balance, or where is that now?
So I know you want to talk, Shilpa. As soon as I answer this, we'll turn to you. Okay. So I'm at a medical school. We don't have to teach. But 8 years ago, I decided to teach a virology course to our undergraduates. And I can tell you this has been fabulous, because they appreciate the passion that I bring and the 30 years of experience. They can't get that anywhere else, very few places. Now, at undergraduate institutions, the load is typically high, at least one course a semester. And not everybody likes that, okay? And they view it as a burden. But I'm in a good position where I can choose to teach, and under those conditions, I wouldn't have it any other way. In fact, if I were to do my career over, I would go to an undergraduate institution and teach and have them work in my lab. I think that would be the best combination of everything. A small college, and get people, because right now, just teaching undergrads, I can get them excited about viruses and want to go into microbiology. And just think if I could pull them in my lab. Shilpa.
I also wanted.
Yeah, I think you have to turn it on. Is this on automatically? Yeah.
I also wanted to add to that the reason.
Can't
so
hear
I
you.
think.
Can you turn up the handheld?
Is it on now?
Is there a switch?
It says it's on.
Yeah, it's on. He used to turn it up.
Okay. Oh yeah.
There
So
you
now it's on. So just to add on to the way that students think of the 5-year increments now, one of the biggest, so when I was actually looking into different careers, one of the biggest things that I learned is that it's easy to take a scientist and teach them teach them different things or different aspects of a particular position than the other way around. So for example, you can't take a good writer and expect them to write about science, right? Because they just don't have that scientific knowledge background. And so that's one of those things that stuck with me. So like even when I started at this job, they wanted me to design a website, but I was like, I've never designed a website before. I don't know exactly what you could do. And so going back to the thing, the 5-year increments, sometimes it's taking like what skills and what experiences you need from a particular job and then moving it to another position where you can apply it. And so I think that's why a lot of people think of it not so much like, what am I going to do forever, but what's the next step for me? What skills and experiences do I need in order to get into, whatever next position I want to go into? And so, that's one of the reasons why I think a lot of students think they know that in order to get into a specific sector, they need certain skills and experiences, and it's just a matter of grabbing those and then, launching into a specific career.
So speaking of next positions, Shilpa, you're in a postdoc. What's next for you?
Yeah, so the field of career development and professional development is traditionally found at university campuses, either through the graduate school or the career center, or some universities will have a professional development office. And so some of these are funded by NIH because NIH is, like I said, they really want to improve graduate education and the curriculum. So they've given grants to different universities to sort of test out different methods and modules and incorporate things into the curriculum and see how they go. So for me next, I'm thinking of looking into the different universities and seeing what comes out of that. But yeah, typically like a lot of universities, they'll have a professional development office or a career center or graduate school, and they're looking to hire at least like 2 to 3 people that work on professional development.
So how would you stay in touch with students who are getting PhDs in that? I know you talked about sending out questionnaires, but what other ways could you use to be in touch and understand what their needs are and so forth?
Well, I mean, one of the biggest things is to really just, talk to the students and understand what things they're facing. But the other side of it too is to think about what are employers looking for as well. So I think my mic keeps going in and out, but.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. But yeah, in general, it's also understanding what employers are looking for.
Yeah,
they know that they are looking for a specific scientist, but what specifically are they lacking that they wish that?
And by employers, you don't just mean universities and companies, law firms, scientific writing places, anything you can think of.
Yeah, anything you can think of, anything that touches microbial sciences at least, or biomedical sciences.
Right.
Yeah.
So I want all 3 of you to address this kind of broader question in the time remaining here. And we'll start with you, Shilpa. So is it okay to say as an undergrad, I'm excited about science, I want to get a PhD, and then decide it's not for you and do something else? Or should you try and figure it out as much as you can ahead of time by talking to people like you?
Yeah, so it's better to, this is my personal opinion, it's better to figure it out sooner rather than later. The thing that I wish I did when I look back is going to the career center. Something as simple as like going to the career center in undergrad, which I never did. It was just like I was doing research, I was like, I love research, so I'm just gonna go down this route. But the lack of knowledge is what kind of kept me in the dark, you could say. Like, if I had just gone to the Career Center to learn about, okay, well, what are the different things that are out there? Maybe there would have been something else that seemed appealing. And just from a personal standpoint, when I was going through grad school and I figured out I didn't want to do research, I was always wondering, well, what can I do? So I made it a point to go to as many career panels, do as many informational interviews, so meeting with people and asking them, well, what do you do? How did you get there? What do you like about your job? What don't you like about your job? And based on a lot of these interviews and just learning about the different career paths, I would always ask myself, is this something I would want to do? Like, what sounded appealing to me when they were talking to me? What didn't? And I would actually keep a journal of it just to make sure that if I saw any trends, it would pop out, you know? And so that's something that, you know, once you figure it out, the earlier you start in terms of like figuring out what you want to do, you could really then focus the rest of your time on, okay, well, what experiences do I need in order to get to that job? And so once you figure it out and get those experiences and you network, which is another big thing in finding a job, then that really lines you up well in terms of getting into a specific career, whatever you choose.
Katie, what are your thoughts, you know, having seen many people go through a PhD and then deciding that it doesn't work for them? Should we make it harder for people to get into PhD programs, to sort of vet them and make sure they're really committed to that?
Yeah, I don't know about making it harder, but I would encourage people to, as you stated, to really be thoughtful about what you're doing sooner. The sooner the better. But that being said, you know, for example, I had a postback in my lab who, when she first came, you know, she wasn't quite sure what she wanted to do, and then she thought maybe I'll go into a med tech program. But then after about a year of really spending time at the bench, and her project was not easy at all. I mean, I really have to give her credit for that. She's like, you know, I think I want to go to graduate school and get a master's degree. So she really was thoughtful about the time that she spent there, and so she could have very easily said, well, I don't want to do bench science, but I think you have to have that combination of definitely talk to as many people as possible, but also give yourself an opportunity, if it presents itself, to try something out, whether it's a summer internship or a postback, or I'm sure there's internships when people are in undergraduate to participate in things like policy and things like that. So I think gain the experience and try to make the best educated decision that you can. So I don't know about necessarily making it harder to get a PhD. It would be nice maybe if they did have a little bit of a vetting program, like, you know, why do you want to do this? Do you know what you're in store for?
We've talked about this because we have a PhD program. We've talked about raising the bar. We get lots of applicants who have worked as undergrads in a lab, and they say, yeah, I enjoyed it, so I'm going to get a PhD. And I think the PIs need to sit down with them and say, look, this is what's involved. It's not just streaking out bacteria. That's not just all of it.
Yeah.
I think part of the problem falls on the PI because they're not giving them good advice, and that's why we need more people need to go to career offices and hopefully they can get good advice there. See, that's the thing. I'm not convinced that they always can.
I think that's absolutely true. It's very much dependent on what PIs you're talking to. I'm crystal clear with my trainees about if you're going to be at the bench, this is the kind of time commitment and personal commitment that you're looking to make just to be successful. And I haven't met a PI that disagrees with that. So I think it's really the more people that they talk to and more resources that they try to tap into, the better.
Yeah, just to add on to the trick between deciding on a career sort of early in the undergraduate stage is that you're still trying to figure yourself out. And so just taking those opportunities to intern at different places or, you know, do job shadowing is really helpful then, because even though you may not be able to get your feet fully wet in a specific career, you can still get some perspective from those experiences. And so it's definitely harder. It's hard to walk that line of like deciding on a career earlier when you're also still trying to figure yourself out and what you like and don't like. So,
Michael, you
I think it's a really interesting question because when I first got to BARDA, I realized that many of these people had gone through a full PhD and then decided that research wasn't their calling. And I thought, what a waste. But as I got deeper into the program, I actually began to appreciate the difference between someone who's trained as a PhD and someone who's trained as a BA or BS or whatever. And although they didn't take a career in science, they're far more talented or ready for a job. I think of it as when you graduate from college, you know how to solve a problem. When you graduate from grad school, you know how to manage a portfolio, or your level of understanding is that much higher. That I found that these people, even though they weren't going into research, were far more valuable getting the job done than they were otherwise. So I have a feeling that my mind has changed on this. I'm much more accepting of that and finding that even though they aren't continuing in science, the education that they got is one that prepares them better for everything else in life. And I think it just becomes a question of whether or not we have the slots and we have, what does the environment look like? Can we support how many scientists? And training people as PhDs that don't go into science, there are room for some of those. I just don't know if the right balance has been achieved. But I do say that my mind has changed such that I kind of appreciate that person more than I would have before I had this job.
I just worry, I sit in my faculty meetings and they're talking about recruiting and increasing the number of PhD students. And I just say they're not pairs of hands for you. That's what a lot of people look at them. They're disposable pairs of hands to do your work, get your grant renewed. It's not right. They have to have a career. And you have to train them properly. And that's why I say don't increase the program until you figure out how to counsel people properly and make sure they know what they're getting into.
Or you can mentor them
And I
to
think-
have those other, other careers other than being at the bench. That's okay.
In a
Totally,
sense,
yeah.
in a sense, I guess what I'm saying is that that person is valuable, but the question is, how much can we afford? And I don't know the answer to that. And I think that you certainly, if everyone's a PhD, then PhD has no value.
Yeah.
But if everyone goes into research, then that's not good either. So we have to figure out where that balance is.
All right, that's our episode of TWiM from Biothreats. You can find TWiM at many places, asm.org/TWiM, iTunes. If you have a smartphone or an iPad, that's usually how you listen to these. They're free apps that you can use to subscribe. We love getting questions and comments from our listeners. You can send them to twim@microbe.tv and consider supporting us. We have several ways that you can help us out financially. You can go to microbe.tv/contribute. That helps us travel. You notice I'm the only member of the TWiM team here, but if we have support from our listeners, we could have more as well. I want to thank our guest today from Rocky Mountain Laboratory, M.Bosio. Thank
Pleasure
you so
as
much.
always.
You're going to mention your son's name?
Go Sam.
There you go. There you go. Michael Merchlinsky at BARDA. Thank you so much, Michael. Appreciate it. And Shilpa Gadwal. American
Thank you for
Society.
having me.
Thank you so much.
Be such a
I want to thank the organizers of ASM Biothreats, Anthony Griffiths and Wyndham Latham, for having TWiM at this meeting. Wyndham was on TWiM last year here. Maybe that had something to do with it. Who knows? And I also want to thank ASM for their support of TWiM, in particular Chris Gandian and Ray Ortega, who usually help us a lot, and they're back in the back of the room running the cameras and the tricorder. Thanks, gentlemen. I also want to thank the sponsor of this episode, Blue Apron. The music that you hear on TWiM is composed and performed by Ronald Jenkins. You can find his work at ronaldjenkins.com. Thanks for listening, everyone. See you next time on This Week in Microbiology.